There was a moment when something inside me reacted before I understood why. Not instinct. Not fear. Recognition. I would walk into a room and feel it shift. I would read a message and already know what it meant before finishing the sentence. It was subtle, but it was always first. The voice did not speak immediately. It waited. And when it did, it was never surprised. I would think something, and it would respond as if it had already been there. As if it had been watching. As if it had been ahead of me. There was a night I remember clearly. I was alone. No distractions. No noise. Just silence. And before a thought fully formed in my head, the voice finished it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just calmly. Like it already knew the ending. That was when I understood something unsettling. It was not reacting to me. It was anticipating me. It knew the doubt before I admitted it. It knew the fear before I felt it. It knew the decision before I made it. And that meant one thing. It had been there longer than I realized. I tried to test it. I would pause mid-thought. I would attempt to think randomly. Something meaningless. Something unexpected. But even then, there was a pause. And then the response. Measured. Accurate. Prepared. That was when the distance between me and it began to shrink. If it knew before I did, then what exactly was I? Was I the one deciding? Or was I arriving at conclusions it had already reached? That question stayed longer than I wanted it to. There is something unsettling about realizing your reaction is not original. That your hesitation has a pattern. That your fear follows a script. And the voice. It never sounded confused. It never searched for answers. It simply waited for me to catch up. I started noticing smaller things. A tension before a conversation turned cold. A heaviness before bad news arrived. A certainty before disappointment. It was always there first. Like a shadow slightly ahead of my steps. The unsettling part was not that it knew. It was how calm it was about knowing. No urgency. No warning. Just awareness. Like it had seen this version of me before. Like this was not the first time. I began wondering something I never wanted to ask. What if the voice is not predicting? What if it is remembering? What if I am the one catching up to something that already understands the outcome? That thought changed everything. Because if it knows before I do, then maybe it is not separate. Maybe it is the part of me that has already walked this path. The part that recognizes patterns. The part that has watched every mistake. And every repeat. There is a quiet truth most people never say out loud. You do not choose as freely as you think. You follow tendencies. You repeat cycles. You lean toward familiar endings. And something inside you knows exactly where that leads. The voice did not need to control me. It only needed to wait. Because sooner or later, I would arrive exactly where it expected. And that was the most unsettling part. Not that it spoke. Not that it anticipated, but that it was right. Every time. So now when I feel it move first, when I sense the answer before the question, when I recognize the ending before the beginning, I do not fight it. I listen. Because maybe it does not know before I do. Maybe. It is me. Just without denial. There was a shift after that realization. I stopped arguing with the voice. I started observing it. When a decision appeared in my mind, I would pause. Not to change it, but to see if it had already formed somewhere deeper. Most of the time, it had. It began to feel less like an interruption, and more like a preview, like watching a reflection move a fraction of a second before you do. Not enough to alarm you, just enough to unsettle you. I noticed something else. The voice never rushed toward chaos. It was patient, cold, precise. When I wanted to react emotionally, it stayed steady. When I wanted to speak too quickly, it remained silent. It understood consequences before I did. That was when doubt turned into something heavier. If it understood consequences, then why did it allow me to make mistakes? Why did it let me walk into situations it clearly anticipated? The answer came slowly. It was not there to control. It was there to witness. And witnessing is different from interfering. It observes patterns. It recognizes repetition. But it does not force change. Because change only matters when you choose it consciously, not when you are pushed. There were moments when I tested this theory. I would deliberately choose differently. Say the unexpected thing. Take the unfamiliar route. Break the routine. And for a brief second, there was silence. Not empty silence, but recalculating silence. Like something adjusting. Like a system rewriting its prediction. And then, calm returned. As if it had adapted instantly. That was when I understood the final layer. It did not know because the future was fixed. It knew because I was predictable. My fears had patterns. My comfort had boundaries. My decisions followed familiar paths. The voice was not ahead of time. It was ahead of denial. It saw the version of me I refused to acknowledge. The habits I defended. The excuses I repeated. It knew me without illusion. There is something terrifying about being fully understood, especially by yourself. No performance. No distraction. No story you can hide behind. Just clarity. Unfiltered. So now when it speaks first, I listen differently. Not with fear. Not with resistance. But with awareness. Because maybe the voice is not predicting failure. Maybe it is offering alignment. It knows before I do. Because it does not lie to itself. And the more honest I become, the quieter it gets. Not because it disappears, but because we are no longer divided. The unsettling part was never that something inside me knew first. The unsettling part was realizing it had always been me, just without excuses. For a while, things felt balanced. Like two versions of me had finally signed a quiet agreement. No more resistance. No more arguing in the dark. Just observation and understanding. But balance does not remove tension. It only makes it visible. Because once you know a pattern, you cannot pretend you do not see it. And awareness carries responsibility. The voice began to speak less frequently. Not because it had nothing to say, but because I was starting to anticipate it. I could feel the shape of its response before it formed. Like muscle memory, but deeper. One night, I tested something dangerous. I made a decision I knew was wrong. Not impulsively. Not emotionally. Deliberately. Just to see if the voice would react. It did not shout. It did not warn. It did not repeat itself. It simply went silent. That silence was heavier than any warning. Because for the first time, it felt like disappointment. Not anger. Not fear. Disappointment. And that is when I understood something terrifying. The voice was not separate from me. It was the version of me that had already learned the lesson. the part that had already processed the outcome. When I ignored it, I was not defying something external. I was choosing to regress, to repeat what had already been understood, to walk backwards into consequences I recognized. The voice returned the next morning, calm, neutral, no resentment, just clarity. And that made it worse, because clarity leaves no room for excuses. It does not accuse. It does not dramatize. It simply shows you the truth in stillness and waits. I started to notice something else. The voice only appeared when I was alone, not physically, but internally. When there were no distractions, no noise, no performance. It never interrupted conversations, never sabotaged social moments, never surfaced during chaos. It waited for quiet, like it respected the boundaries of reality, which raised a question I had been avoiding. If it only appeared in silence, what would happen if the silence disappeared? If I drowned it out long enough? So I tried. I filled my days with constant noise, music, podcasts, notifications, background sound at all times, no empty space. For a few days it worked. The voice faded, not because it was gone, but because I refused to give it room. But something else happened. My decisions became slower, heavier, less precise. I hesitated more, second-guessed more, doubted more. The voice had never been the problem. It had been a calibration, a compass, and without it, everything felt slightly misaligned. That was when I stopped fighting the silence. I turned off the noise, sat still, waited, and eventually, it returned. Not dramatic, not loud, just a simple awareness, like a steady light switching back on. It did not say, "I told you so." It did not remind me of mistakes. It simply resumed, as if nothing had happened, as if patience had always been part of its design. And that was when the final realization settled in. It knew before I did, because it was not bound by fear. Fear delays understanding. Fear distorts perception. Fear resists truth. The voice did not fear consequences. It accepted them. And because it accepted them, it could see clearly. The unsettling truth was not that something inside me knew first. The unsettling truth was this: I always knew. I just did not want to. After that realization, something subtle changed. The voice did not feel separate anymore. It felt integrated. Not above me, not ahead of me, but aligned. And yet, there was still distance. Because knowing something intellectually is different from embodying it. Understanding is quiet. Transformation is uncomfortable. The voice began asking questions instead of giving answers. Not in words, in awareness. Why are you hesitating? What are you protecting? Who are you trying to impress? Those questions did not accuse. They exposed. And exposure is rarely comfortable, especially when the illusion starts cracking. I began catching myself mid-thought, mid-excuse, mid-justification. And before I could defend it, the awareness was already there, waiting. It knew the reason before I spoke it. It knew the fear before I named it. It recognized the pattern before I admitted it. And slowly, I stopped pretending. There is a strange peace that comes with radical honesty. Not the honesty you perform for others, The honesty that exists when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, nothing to prove. The voice softened, not because it weakened, but because resistance was fading. It did not need to anticipate anymore. I was beginning to move in sync with it. Decisions felt cleaner. Conversations felt grounded. Reactions felt measured. It was not that life became easier. It became clearer. And clarity removes drama. Clarity removes unnecessary suffering. Clarity removes the endless internal debate. It simplifies everything. But clarity also removes comfort. Because once you see clearly, you are responsible for your habits, for your environment, for your outcomes. The voice did not control me. It revealed me. And once revealed, there was no returning to ignorance. That was when I understood the final layer of all of this. It never knew before I did. It knew at the same time. I just delayed acceptance. Fear creates delay. Ego creates distortion. Distraction creates noise. Remove those. And what remains is immediate awareness. The voice was not prophetic. It was present. Fully present. Without bias. Without defense. Without avoidance. And presence feels like prediction to a distracted mind. Because when you are not fully here, anything clear feels supernatural. The unsettling truth was simple. The version of me that was honest was faster. Faster at seeing consequences. Faster at recognizing patterns. Faster at understanding intention. And the more I aligned with that version, the less I experienced internal conflict. Not because life changed, but because I stopped arguing with reality. The voice still appears sometimes, but now it feels like instinct, like intuition, like grounded clarity. Not an intruder, not a stranger. It does not speak often, because it does not need to. When you live in alignment, silence is confirmation. And maybe that is the final truth. Nothing inside you is ahead of you. It is simply waiting for you to stop running. There were still moments of resistance. Old habits do not disappear quietly. They negotiate. They justify. They try to survive. And sometimes, they almost win. I would feel the urge to ignore what I knew again, to take the easier option, to choose comfort over clarity. And for a split second, the old delay returned. But something was different now. The delay was shorter, the denial weaker, the awareness stronger, like a muscle that had finally been trained. The voice did not need to intervene, because I could feel it forming. A quiet tightening in my chest. A subtle stillness in my thoughts. A pause before action. That pause became everything. It was small, barely noticeable, but inside it was freedom. Freedom to respond instead of react. Freedom to choose instead of repeat. Freedom to act without self-betrayal. And that was when I realized something deeper. The voice was never trying to control my future. It was protecting my integrity. Integrity is alignment between thought and action, between knowing and doing. Every time I ignored it in the past, I felt fragmented, split between who I was and who I knew I could be. That split created anxiety, regret, restlessness. But when I listened, even if the decision was difficult, there was peace, not excitement, not relief. Peace. Peace is quiet. It does not celebrate loudly. It does not demand attention. It simply settles and stays. The strangest part? The voice never told me what I wanted to hear. It told me what was necessary. Sometimes that meant walking away. Sometimes that meant speaking up. Sometimes that meant admitting I was wrong. And every time I followed through, something inside me strengthened. Not ego. Not pride. Trust. Trust in myself. Trust in my awareness. Trust that I could face consequences without collapsing. That trust reduced fear. And when fear reduces, clarity accelerates. That is why it always seemed ahead, because it was unafraid. One evening, sitting alone in the dark, I asked silently, "Will you ever disappear?" There was no verbal response, just a steady sense of presence, like a quiet understanding. It was not there to dominate. It was there to integrate. And that was when the final fear dissolved. The fear that I was divided. The fear that something inside me was separate. The fear that I was not whole. There was never a second voice. There was only awareness arriving before acceptance. There was only truth arriving before courage. It knew before I did. Because it was not negotiating with comfort. It was aligned with reality. And the moment I stopped negotiating, we became the same. Not two perspectives. Not two versions. Just clarity. The voice did not predict my future. It reminded me of who I already was. And once I stopped resisting that, there was nothing left to fear. For a while, everything felt stable, aligned, clear. And that was when something unexpected happened. The voice stopped arriving first. Not completely, not suddenly, but subtly. I would reach awareness, and there would be no anticipation, no preview, just presence. At first, I thought I had lost it. That maybe the silence had swallowed it whole. That maybe clarity had replaced it. But something felt different. Then it became obvious. It was not arriving first anymore. Because there was no delay left. There was no gap between knowing and accepting. Awareness and action had synchronized. The split had dissolved. There was no before, no after, just immediacy. And in that immediacy, there was a stillness deeper than anything I had felt before. Not dramatic, not intense, just steady, grounded, whole. The voice had not disappeared. It had merged. What once felt like guidance now felt like instinct. And instinct does not announce itself. It does not warn. It does not narrate. It simply moves. I realized something profound in that moment. The voice was never ahead of me. It was the version of me without hesitation, without ego, without fear. Fear creates distance. Ego creates noise. Hesitation creates the illusion of separation. Remove those, and there is only clarity. I sat alone that night in complete silence. No music. No distractions. No thoughts chasing each other. Just stillness. And for the first time, there was no voice arriving before me. Because there was nothing left to correct. Nothing left to warn. Nothing left to resist. The unsettling mystery had become something simple. It knew before I did. Because I delayed truth. That was all. And once truth stopped being delayed, time felt different. Decisions felt immediate. Life felt direct. There was no prophecy. No supernatural force. No hidden intelligence. only awareness waiting patiently for courage. That is the part no one talks about. Awareness is easy, acceptance is hard, and courage is the bridge between them. The voice never wanted control. It wanted alignment. And alignment does not shout. It does not demand. It simply exists. If you ever feel like something inside you knows first, pause. It is not ahead of you. It is waiting for you. And the moment you stop running, you will realize it was never separate. It was always you. I thought integration would feel triumphant, like a victory, like something conquered. It did not. It felt neutral, and that neutrality was strange, because I had grown used to tension, to friction, to internal conflict. Without it, there was space, and space can be uncomfortable. When you remove noise, you start hearing subtler things, quieter truths, deeper patterns. That was when I noticed something unsettling. The awareness was no longer only about me. It extended outward, into people, into situations, into rooms. I could sense hesitation in others, predict reactions, feel tension before words formed. Not in a mystical way, in a pattern recognition way. When you become honest with yourself, you start recognizing dishonesty quickly, not to judge, but because distortion becomes obvious, and that awareness changes interactions. You stop over-explaining. You stop performing. You stop trying to convince. Because you already know how things will unfold. Not perfectly, but directionally. Human behavior has rhythm. Emotion has repetition. And suddenly, the world felt predictable. Not boring. Predictable. That predictability brought another question. If patterns are visible, can they be broken? Or are we all moving along invisible scripts? The old version of me would have searched for control, for advantage, for manipulation. The aligned version simply observed. Because awareness is powerful, but intention determines its impact. And clarity without integrity becomes strategy. That was the final test. Not whether I could hear the voice, but whether I could use awareness responsibly. It is easy to see patterns. It is harder to remain kind while seeing them. It is easy to predict outcomes. It is harder to allow people their process. The voice did not return as guidance. It returned as restraint. A quiet reminder. Just because you see clearly does not mean you interfere. And that is when I understood the final truth of all. Clarity is not power. Clarity is responsibility. It knew before I did. Because it was never emotional about truth. It was patient, steady, unattached. And now that I no longer resist it, there is no voice ahead of me. There is only awareness moving with me. If you ever feel that internal pause, that quiet knowing before action, do not fear it. Do not label it strange. Do not silence it. It is not predicting your future. It is protecting your alignment. And when alignment becomes natural, you stop asking, "How did it know?" Because you finally understand. It was never ahead of you. You were just late to accept yourself.